The French and Indian War actually had many heroes and had many um, people who would later become famous as founders of the American Republic were involved, including Ben Franklin, and most famously George Washington, who is actually given some credit by some people for having started the war as a young lieutenant, but he made up for it somewhat later on, serving with the British and with General Braddock, who managed to stumble into the woods of these areas that were being contested and get himself killed and many of his people wiped out because they simply did not understand the rules of warfare in the new America. And this um, struggle between the way things were done in Europe and the way things were evolving in the United States, where the settlers had learned many lessons from the American Indians, and some of those had to do with a very pragmatic approach to warfare. So this was the training ground. This is where George Washington lost some of his first battles. He was a general, well, many famous generals turn out to be, who lost many battles. But fortunately for us, he finally won the war. So, The Last of the Mohicans. This is the novel that I'd like to focus on today. And The Last of the Mohicans represents this wild period, this very contested period in which the French and the Indians and different Indian tribes are struggling for very confused ends. The objectives of each of the parties were not always clear to even their allies. So it resulted in a lot of violence, is what it did. It resulted in a lot of violence and a lot of misunderstanding, and that is at the core of this novel. Also at the core of the novel is a place called Fort William Henry. This is the center of the action for at least the first part of the novel. The most famous scene, I'm trying not to give away too much, but I will give away this because it's simply part of a historic fact, is that the Fort William Henry was surrounded by the French during the war, and they were offered terms of surrender, which would allow them to basically abandon the fort and go back to another fort, British fort that was nearby. Um, but something went wrong. Major misunderstanding between the French and their allied Indian tribes, and a considerable massacre took place. Anywhere from a couple of hundred to 1,000, depending on which news reports of the time you're reading. But it was it was a major story of the times, and this forms the center of a lot of the drama in the book. The Native American heroes of this novel, Natty's friends, Jingakook and Uncas, will ultimately meet tragic ends, but they are depicted with a raw nobility and skills as warriors that reminds me of Greek heroes. Later American movies tended to show the Indians as simply bad guys to be killed or guided by the wise settler leaders, but not Cooper. He had a much more realistic perspective on the uh, indigenous tribes. His Native Americans are true heroes in the classic sense, occasionally fickle and very human, but possessed of noble spirits. None more so than the duplicitous and resilient villain of the novel, Mogwai. He keeps getting knocked down in confrontations, but he keeps getting up and coming back for more. If you were writing this from the French perspective or the perspective of the French allies, he would be a major hero. Cooper writes of the Native Americans, of the Delaware Indians, the Mohicans in particular. Few men exhibit greater diversity, or, if we may so express it, greater antithesis of character than the native warrior of North America. In war, he is daring, boastful, cunning, ruthless, self-denying, and self-devoted. In peace, just, generous, hospitable, revengeful, superstitious, modest, and commonly chaste. Many a Greek hero would not mind being described in that manner. No story is complete without a good supporting cast, and this novel has them. One is the comic, but ultimately heroic, David Gamut. He's a Calvinist preacher, he's a music teacher, and as far as the Indians are concerned, he is crazy, which allows him considerable privilege. The Indians in this novel see him as kind of touched by God, but perhaps not in a way that David would want to be seen. Then there is Major Duncan Hayward. Major Hayward is an American, but he's serving with the British. His situation's a lot like, well, George Washington's. He's a young officer, but he happens to be in love with one of the femme fatales of this story, and he is quietly pursuing her love interest. He is kind of out of his place in the woods. He kind of depicts the city-born coastal sort of Americans being lost in the woods and not really being able to cope, but learning, evolving, just as our comic hero David Gamut does. Then there's our heroines. And I'm showing two different versions of our heroines here because there have been at least 5 movies made of this story because it's so popular, and it's been made pretty much since there have been movies being made. The two characters are Cora Monroe, dark hair, and Alice Monroe, blonde hair. Alice is the one everyone loves. Cora is the level-headed one with a secret. So, interesting characters, and in the novel, neither of them is a love interest for Natty Bumpo. I'm going to try not to give you too many spoilers, but here's a glimpse of what you'll find in the novel. Man against nature. Thrilling boat rides. Man against man. More violence. A lot of comedy. A lot of mix-ups and misunderstandings. Peril. A little romance. And more mix-ups and misunderstandings. Then you get some glimpse into American Indian culture of that era, and you get some glimpse into tragedy, the climactic end. See this movie. It's an entirely different story. There's very little resemblance between the movie and the book, but it's a very good movie. Thank you.